What is going on, guys? I am Paul Ryan, your host of the Not ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. With me, as always, is the best co-host in the world, Mr. Dave PigskinPapers Hartman. Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well, Paul. How are you doing tonight?
Can't complain, man. Enjoying the nice Sunday.
All right.
Dave, where can we find you on X?
Yep, on X, I am at PigskinPapers. Both of those P's are capitalized, and you can find all my fantasy football content at Big Blue View, which is the Giants blog on the SB Nation website. And I just posted a Giants fantasy preview, which there isn't that much to say, but that was my last. I've really been writing not Giants specific stuff. That was the first article I've written there that hasn't just been a general fantasy football article. So yeah. How about you, Paul? Where can people find you on X, and what kind of content are you working on right now?
Yes, I am Paul Ryan. You can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15. And as of right now, just working on this show with you, Dave, and of course the Cowboys content that you can find on YouTube and on X every Monday night. But going back to this show, Dave, last week we took a break from our series Divisions of Fantasy to break down our Scott Fishbowl rosters and share our thoughts on early training camp reports. But tonight we'll jump right back into it. Our guest tonight was nominated by the creator of Fantasy and Frames, Jorge Edwards, who was our guest last time we did this show. Joining us tonight is co-host of the Three Man Rush podcast, fantasy analyst and ranker for Fantasy and Frames. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Drew to the show. Drew, how are you?
I'm doing well, gentlemen. I appreciate you guys inviting me. And then, a special thank you to Jorge as well. He was the one that gave me my first opportunity in the fantasy football space. And then now, gave me the shout out to come on the show tonight. So I appreciate him. Appreciate you guys for having me on too.
Drew, we were talking pre-roll, talking about some baseball, and I'm looking at your shirt, looking at that St. Louis Cardinals shirt, and I'm trying not so hard not to be angry.
With you being a Rangers fan, me being a Cardinals fan, I would understand if there was a little bit of anger under there. I certainly would get it. So I wouldn't hold it against you one bit.
Yes, sir. Hey, but we'll save that conversation for another day, man. Let's talk some football tonight.
Let's do it.
Where can we find you on X?
So I'm over on Twitter at Drew3MR. And then as far as all of my work goes, I co-host the Fourth and Frames podcast. We're mainly a redraft podcast on the Fantasy and Frames Network. We go live every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. And then me and a couple of my closest buddies, we do the Three Man Rush podcast, which is more of just like sitting back talking football. Not really. We mix in a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of DFS, and then really just chopping it up and talking ball. We live stream about like once a month, so it's not near as often, but just get together when we can to talk ball. So we do that as well. And then all of any articles I write, all of my rankings, redraft, dynasty, all that can be found on the Fantasy and Frames website as well.
Awesome, man.
Excellent. Drew, I'll show my age right now. We'll talk a little more baseball. I'm a Mets fan.
Okay.
And when I was growing up, the Mets and the Cardinals were bitter division rivals because they were both in the East. There was no NL Central.
Right.
It was just an East and a West. And 1985 was the year they really the Mets and Cardinals went down to a final 3-game series in St. Louis. Cardinals were up 3. The Mets needed to sweep the series to tie the division and force a 1-game playoff or whatever they did. And the Mets got the first 2 games. And then the Cardinals got the 3rd game. And this was before there was a wild card. The Mets and Cardinals had the 2 best records in the National League, but they were in the same division. So I'm not bitter about it anymore. But, when they added the wild card and things like that, I was like, well, why didn't we have that in 1985?
It would have been nice to have that back then, right?
Yeah. That Cardinal team, man, they stole so many bases. It was unbelievable. As soon as a guy got on base, he was on third. It was they were a really hard team to play because of that. It was that Whitey Herzog was the manager, and they had, Vince Coleman and Willie McGee and Tommy, all these guys who could steal bases. So anyway,
ran like crazy.
They did. That's kind of left the game, which is a shame.
It is. I agree.
Punting and stealing bases is kind of gone. But anyway, we're here to talk about football, not baseball. So I'm not going to take us too far down that tangent. We're really excited to have you here tonight, Drew. And I think we're going to have an exciting discussion because the NFC West, which is the division we're going to talk about tonight, really is one of the better divisions in the NFL. You know, sent the NFC's Super Bowl entrant last year in the 49ers. The Rams have recently won a Super Bowl. You know, the Seahawks in the last 15 years have won a Super Bowl. And the Cardinals are kind of a fun and up and coming team. So we're going to talk about the division, you know, really from a fantasy perspective. And it's a good division in that regard too. There's a lot of high profile players. So with players like Christian McCaffrey and DK Metcalf, Cooper Kupp, Kyler Murray, just to name a few, you've also probably got the first rookie that'll get taken in one QB league drafts anyway, in Marvin Harrison Jr. I think last year the division had the two best waiver wire pickups in Kieran Williams and Puka Nacua. It's just been a really fun division for fantasy for the last couple of years, and I think it will be again. So the question I have for you is, do I have a question for you? Yeah, well, just give me your overall kind of thought about this division. Like, what are you, just from a fantasy perspective, kind of what's your general takeaway, and what should we be looking for this season from this division?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it well. It's just a lot of firepower. You know, obviously the 49ers, they have a ton to be excited about with the playmakers they have there with CMC, Debo, Aiyuk, George Kittle. You know, the Rams, the two waiver wire targets that you mentioned from last year, they're back, and Kyron Williams, Puka Nacua. They spent a day 2 pick on another running back. Cooper Kupp supposedly healthy, so the Rams should have a lot to be excited about. We got a healthy Kyler Murray. We've got Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride, who was, you know, the breakout tight end from last year. They should have another big year. And James Conner, Trey Benson, that should be a fun backfield to watch for the year. And then the Seahawks, you know, I think that's the team really that I think is most interesting to me at this point, with Geno Smith and that injury coming out and not really knowing what to make of that. And if we're going to be looking at another season of Sam Howell possibly throwing the ball much more than he should. But because, I mean, the Seahawks, they have a bunch of playmakers that could be excited, guys that we could be excited to draft as well. But if we don't know what the quarterback situation looks like, then it's a little bit harder to be confident in DK Metcalf and JSN, Tyler Lockett. And then you've got Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet in the backfield. So I think it's a division that has a lot of firepower and a lot of guys that you're going to be really excited to have on your teams this year.
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot to like about this division, and Jorge told me that, Drew, you are a big fan of the LA Rams, so I can't wait to hear your thoughts on them. But before we talk about the Rams, let's discuss the San Francisco 49ers. You mentioned Brandon Aiyuk, and last year we saw him have his breakout season, but now he's doing a hold and waiting for a new contract. But the Niners have made it clear he won't get a new deal this season. Is Aiyuk worth drafting at his ADP and redraft leagues for you?
I think he is, just because of the upside he carries. There is a little bit of a risk if he gets traded, but honestly, I just don't think he really has much leverage at this point. I mean, he's on his rookie deal with how expensive they've made holding out as far as, you know, the player agreement and things like that. I don't really see a world where he doesn't suit up, even if he doesn't get traded. Where the gamble comes in is if he, you know, in San Francisco, we're okay with him being in that offense with how loaded it is, right? Even though that 1 week it might be Debo's week, 1 week it might be Kittle's week, with how efficient that offense is, with Kyle Shanahan calling plays, and with you know, with all the playmakers that are there, it's okay that the room's a little bit crowded. Where I would start to get concerned if he gets traded to another offense that doesn't have the obvious hole or need for another pass catcher, you know, because if he's in a crowded offense where Shanahan's not calling the plays anymore, then maybe he's not as intriguing. So there is some room for concern if he does get moved, but to be honest with you, I don't see a world where that ends up happening. I think he's going to be a 49er this year. I just don't think he has a lot of leverage to make the deal happen. And then after this year, that's when I think things start to get interesting. But I think for this year, he's a 49er, and I think that he's going to just continue to ascend as a player.
Absolutely. I can't disagree with you on that.
So two of the 49ers pass catchers were featured in the Netflix series Receiver. And I don't know if you guys watched that, but one of them was George Kittle. I learned a lot more about him. But what we all know about him is he's one of the best all-around tight ends in football between his blocking and his pass catching abilities and his leadership. And in fantasy, he's sometimes one of the best tight ends. He's a bit of a boomer bust player. He's kind of consistent year over year, but not as consistent week to week within season.
Sure.
Do you think he's a better and best ball type player, or is he someone we can trust as a weekly starter? Someone who will cost us a little bit of draft capital this year. Trust as a weekly starter as your TE1.
Yeah, no, he's a week-to-week starter for me. He's not a better and best ball guy by any means. I agree with what you said in terms of his week-to-week consistency can be kind of spotty at times. But as far as his season-long consistency goes, I mean, if you look back to 2018, he's probably been the most consistent tight end not named Travis Kelce, and his route participation numbers have just continued to go up. And my worry 2, 3, 4 years ago with George Kittle was he was such a great blocker that sometimes he would be asked to block so much as opposed to running routes. But that has started to change over the last couple of years, and those route participation numbers just keep going up. And Brock Purdy has continued to look for him since he's taken over as the starting quarterback as well. And so, I mean, I have him as my tight end 7. There's 6 tight ends I have ahead of him with Kelce, Laporta, McBride, Pitts, Andrews, and Dalton Kincaid. But after those 6 guys, he's the next guy off the board for me. I have no problem taking him at ADP, and he's a guy that I'm very comfortable plugging in to my weekly lineup. And there's going to be weeks where he's not going to hit, but again, outside of maybe Kelce, you can pretty much say that for every tight end that you have to put in your starting lineup. And so with George Kittle, he's a guy that I'm very comfortable starting on a weekly basis.
And I think he's 30 this season. 30, yeah, I think he turned 30. Any concerns with that or no?
No, not for me. Which tight ends, they seem to age a little bit different than receivers in terms of the age curve and when they start to fall off. And then George Kittle himself, I mean, you mentioned it. Whenever you watch him on receiver, you could see that he's not your average tight end by any means. And he's been aging very well. And so no, he's, as far as his age cliff goes, I'm not, at least for this year, I'm not concerned.
Another guy that you feel pretty comfortable starting week to week is Christian McCaffrey, and he's been nothing short of elite since he joined the Niners. But Father Time is undefeated, and McCaffrey turned 28 this year. Is it time to sell high on CMC in dynasty leagues?
I think answering that question all depends on the context of your team. If you're a win now team, if you're looking to chase a championship this year, there's no way I'm moving off of Christian McCaffrey. But if I'm in a bit of a rebuild and there's a team out there that is looking to contend and they have a package of first round picks in the upcoming rookie draft, or they have a younger guy that you might be excited, like if you could get Jonathan Brooks plus a couple picks to go along with Christian McCaffrey, something along that line, I don't mind trading Christian McCaffrey if you know that you're not going to be contending. But if you're a contender, I'm just riding it until the wheels fall off. I mean, he's one of those guys that I will just continue to play him every year until he is no longer serviceable, and I'll ride him to as many fantasy championships as I can. So I think it really just comes down to where you're at as a team.
Yeah, you know who else will ride him till the wheels come off as his coach.
You got it.
I think one thing for me, and I agree with everything you said about McCaffrey. I thought it was kind of reckless last year, actually, how Shanahan kept him in games when he didn't need to. And I don't know if he was trying to help him pad his stats or, make sure he got a touchdown every game. But I'll be curious to see if he's a little more judicious with him this year, because there were definitely some games the Niners had in hand, and it was like he didn't trust any of the backups or something, because I think he saw more work than he should have in certain spots last year. And as he does get older, as Paul was saying, I think that is something to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
In any case, I want to talk about their quarterback for a second, because he was mentioned earlier. Brock Purdy has now started 26 regular season games, and he's got 12 QB1 finishes in those 26 games. He's been, pretty excellent. 24 years old. He's about to get a new deal in all likelihood. But, he was a 7th round pick, and actually the last pick of the 7th round when he was taken. A lot of people think it's kind of a system quarterback thing with all the talent they have, both on their offensive line and at the skill position. the skill positions. And so there are some people probably who still have their doubts about Brock Purdy and kind of hold his draft capital against him. Is he someone you trust as your QB1? You could answer it either from the standpoint of a super flex league or just a one QB league. You pretty comfortable taking him kind of like, I think he's most places he's somewhere between the 6th and 10th QB off the board.
Yeah, I've got him at QB10. So I do trust him as my QB1. I have him as a back end QB1. So as far as super flex leagues go, the way that I typically try to play those is I'd like to get a guy in my top 5, top 6, that range, and then possibly get Purdy as my QB2. So in a super flex league, I don't have a problem with him being my QB1. I guess the way that I would draft would just change a little bit, because typically the way that I handle super flex leagues and redraft is I would draft one quarterback pretty early, and then I would wait a little bit while to draft my QB2. Whereas if I'm taking Brock Purdy as my QB1 in a super flex league, I'm probably going to invest in my QB2 a little bit earlier and just have like my QB10 and QB14 or 15, something along that line, on my roster. So, and then in one quarterback leagues, if I want to wait and take a quarterback, if Purdy is going in that, I'm not going to invest in him if he's going to QB6 with me having to make QB10. But if he, if we're late in a 1 QB draft and Purdy's still sitting there and there's been 10, 11, 12 quarterbacks off the board, at that point, that means I'm one of, if not the last person in my league to draft a quarterback. And I'm very happy to take Purdy at that point. And if it doesn't work out, if the efficiency falls off for whatever reason, or if he's just not having as good of a year, then at that point you can just stream the position anyway and just use the waivers to your advantage and grab quarterbacks when you can. And so in one quarterback leagues, if he's going as quarterback 10 to quarterback 12, I have no problem at all taking him as my quarterback 1 at that point.
Let me ask, this question isn't on the show sheet, but just want to ask one more question before we leave the Niners. A lot of times we've seen teams that lose the Super Bowl kind of struggle the next year. I mean, we just saw it with the Eagles too. Right. So it's not that distant to think about. As a general rule, do you have any concerns kind of across the board with the Niners, like that they might have just kind of a fall off on the offense? It's sort of that can happen and they could still be great for fantasy. So it's not, just what are your thoughts generally about where that team might be headed this year?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, but I think with the infrastructure still in place in terms of the coaching staff and the players there, they're pretty much just running it back all over again. And I have to imagine after, as a Rams fan, it makes me smile ear to ear to say this, but after falling short yet again, I'm sure that they are extremely motivated to run it back and to try to get that championship. And so I don't think there's going to be much of a hangover for these guys. I think they're going to be one of the best teams in the NFL again, unfortunately, and I think they're going to have one of the best offenses in the NFL again, since they do still have all of the same pieces in place. So it's not something to where I would be fading any piece of this offense in a fantasy draft because of it.
Now let's move on here to the Cardinals, and like the 49ers, man, they've got a lot of pieces that we like here in fantasy, and one of those pieces being new wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr., who's been on the fantasy radar for a few years now, and he lands in an ideal situation with Kyler Murray there in Arizona. Even though he's unproven, is he already a top 10 dynasty wide receiver for you, Drew?
He is, yeah. I think really where the conversation starts is like top 5, top 6, top 7. I've got Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and CeeDee Lamb comfortably in my tier 1 of dynasty receivers. And then after that is Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, and A.J. Brown. And I think that's where Marvin Harrison Jr. mixes in, is among those guys. If you wanted to take Amon-Ra, I think Amon-Ra is – I think he's a scale above at that point. He should probably be, if anything, in that tier 1 with Jefferson, Chase, and Lamb with what he's put on the field at this point in his career. But once you get to wide receiver 5, 6, 7 with Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, A.J. Brown, I think that's where he starts to mix in. So for me, he's a locked and loaded top 10 dynasty receiver for me.
Yeah.
Excellent. So Trey McBride, once the team got rid of Zach Ertz last year, and that kind of coincided with Kyler coming back also from his ACL injury, Trey McBride really came on down the stretch and ended up as the TE7 for the year, but he was probably higher than that over the second half of the season, maybe like the TE3 or 4, something like that. But the team added Harrison, as we just talked about. They also brought in Zay Jones. Greg Dortch supposedly is having a very good camp. They also still have Michael Wilson. McBride is coming off the board as like the TE2 or TE3 in a lot of drafts. Do you think that's maybe too high for him, and is he a potential bust candidate for this season?
That's honestly right where I've got him. I have him as tight end 3 as well. And the way I've been approaching the tight end position in drafts this year is I just don't want to be the first person in my league to take a tight end, because I have 6 guys that are essentially all in a tier together with Kelsey, Laporta, Trey McBride, Kyle Pitts, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid. I think I could sit here and make a fair argument for any of those guys to finish as a tight end 1 this year. I mean, they're all in top offenses attached to elite quarterbacks, and they're either the number 1 or number 2 option in their passing offense. And even with Marvin Harrison Jr. coming in, I think that statement still holds true for Trey McBride, and he kind of has the leg up over Harrison in the sense of him and Kyler already have some chemistry from working together last year. And if McBride's overall ADP was a little bit more inflated, I think I would be more nervous. But where I feel comfortable taking him is because if you want to invest in Laporta or Kelsey, they're going around 26th, 27th overall. So we're talking about like the 2-3 turn in typical 12-man leagues right now that you have to take Laporta or Kelsey, which is why I don't want to be the one to take the first tight end off the board. Whereas Trey McBride, he's going almost 22, about 21, 22 picks later. So almost 2 full rounds after Kelsey and Laporta are coming off the board. Then McBride comes off the board. So the fact that I can get McBride in around that 4th round area and I don't have to spend a 2nd round pick on him like I do Laporta or Kelsey, I'm pretty comfortable taking him in that spot. So that's kind of that's the sweet spot where I've been trying to invest in tight ends. Is I don't want to leave the first 5 rounds without one of my top 5 or 6 tight ends, and McBride's right there in the middle. So I have no issue with where he's going right now in drafts.
Yeah, you make a good argument there. I don't know. This year's been a little bit different, but more often than not, I usually like to wait on tight ends.
Yeah, it's the tight end position was one that for a while was kind of left for dead in fantasy. Like it was basically just Travis Kelce and everybody else, and you would have like one good year of Mark Andrews, one good year of George Kittle, and there would be guys mixed in, but the only constant really at the position was Travis Kelce. But with Mark Andrews putting some healthy seasons together and the influx in talent that we've seen with these young guys, Laporta, McBride, Dalton Kincaid, the tight end position is finally kind of exciting for the first time in a while. So I'm like you. I used to do, especially in 1 quarterback league, I would just completely punt both quarterback and tight end, and I would just stack up running backs and receivers the first like 6, 7, 8 rounds of the draft and not even touch any other position. But now I've really, whenever the mock drafts I've done and some of the industry drafts that I've done, I've tried to make sure that I'm leaving my draft with one of my top 5 or 6 tight ends. And to do that, you have to spend one of your first 5 rounds, one of those picks on a tight end. But I'm comfortable doing that with the high upside guys we have at the position now. Finally,
yeah, I think that strategy makes sense, especially because there's the 6 guys you named, and then there's Evan Ingram and Jake Ferguson. I kind of would put them also as guys I'd be happy with. And then it really drops off. And if you're in a 12-team league and you're the 10th person taking a tight end or the 11th person, you're getting like Pat Freiermuth or, someone like that, Cole Kmet, like those guys could be okay, but there really is a teardrop there that you want to be on the correct side of, I think. So I agree with what you're saying. I think you want to, in 10 or 12, even 10-team draft, but especially in 12-team drafts, I think you want to leave with, depends who you're comfortable with. But for me, it's one of those first 8. Paul likes when I talk about Jake Ferguson. I actually think he's probably in for a good year too.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think Jake Ferguson is a talent. I don't think he is quite as talented as some of the other names we've talked about, just his overall talent. But what he has going for him is that he is in an offense that is going to throw the ball a ton. And once you get past CeeDee Lamb, who else is really there that's going to be demanding targets? And Jake Ferguson, We've already seen him do it in the past year. And I mean, with what the Cowboys did in the offseason, like the running back room was a big question mark, and they did virtually nothing to address it. So that tells me that they are comfortable just letting Dak throw the ball a ton again this year. And Jake Ferguson, while I don't think he's as talented overall as the guys we've talked about, I do still think that he is a talented player and talented enough to earn targets and to get the job done in an offense that's going to throw the ball a lot. So I do have him comfortably below those other guys that we talked about. But I agree with what you said, David, that I do think that he is the end of a tier where once Jake Ferguson's off the board, now I'm really not feeling good about the tight end position. And I would much rather be the last person taking a quarterback in my league than I would be the last person taking a tight end.
Yeah, very true.
We got a question, Paul. I guess we should answer it, right? Because we're talking about tight ends. I know we're getting far afield from the NFC West, but we got a question from Chris B saying, where are we comfortable taking TJ Hawkinson this season with the health and QB uncertainty? We'll let Drew answer this one. This is a hard question.
Yeah, so that my boy Chris, he's another Fantasy and Frames, part of the Fantasy and Frames family. He was a longtime co-host of the show with me before he decided to focus more on the college fantasy football side, which he's incredible at. He has a show called 1 Foot Down over on Fantasy and Frames that focuses on college fantasy football. If you guys are into that, or anybody listening, if you're into that, you should definitely check that out. But as far as Hawkinson goes, I have him as tight end 13, and so we've talked about the top 7-8 guys, 9. I guess the top 10 guys essentially pretty in depth. But then I've got David Njoku is a guy we haven't talked about, and Pat Freiermuth. Those guys round out my top 12. Once those guys are off the board, the rest of the tight ends I really don't feel that great about. And as far as TJ Hawkinson goes, we know what the talent is, and it's a question mark of when he's going to be back. But I would rather just take the shot on Hawkinson and then throw him if your league has an IR spot, especially because then once the draft's over, throw him in your IR spot and then just pick up a tight end off waivers and just stream the position until Hawkinson gets healthy. So there's 12 tight ends that I want to take. And if I don't get one of those 12 in a draft, I'm comfortable taking Hawkinson and then streaming the position until he gets healthy. And right now he's going off the board as tight end 13.5 PPR scoring according to Fantasy Pros. So I'm comfortable taking him at his ADP. I thought in the season, coming in the draft season, he would be somebody that would be fading because I figured his ADP would be higher than that. But I think his ADP makes sense. I have no problem taking him there and just streaming the position until he's back on the field.
Yeah, in the league I recently took over, the guy who drafted the team, he took a lot of younger tight ends. He decided to wait on tight end, and it kind of ended up biting him. But I was trying to trade for TJ Hawkinson, so it's kind of funny that this question would come up. But I think TJ Hawkinson's like the perfect guy to pair with like a George Kittle, where sometimes he's boom or bust, and if you want to like play matchups and maybe search for a little bit more upside or look for maybe a more certainty with a role like TJ Hawkinson, what he'll have with the Vikings. I like pairing him with another good guy.
Yeah, I like that.
But, as Drew reminds me that the Cowboys didn't adjust the running back room, Trey Benson was the guy that I know a lot of Cowboys fans were excited about, and hopefully maybe Dallas taking a chance on. He lands in Arizona, and it's a pretty exciting landing spot, especially behind a guy like James Conner. But it seems that Amari DiMercato is currently the RB2 and Benson is the RB4. Is Trey Benson maybe a buy low type of player right now?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a dynasty league with anybody that believes that Amari DiMercato is going to be the RB2 in that offense, and you can like send them a screenshot of that blurb and possibly get him for cheaper, absolutely, you should go trade for him. Like, I mean, he's getting the typical rookie treatment, right? Where he has to come in, he has to be able to leapfrog the guys that were already there that are going to be ahead of him on the depth chart. But we've seen Amari DiMercato. We've seen these guys in the opportunities that they were given whenever James Conner wasn't healthy already. And if the Arizona Cardinals thought that they were good pieces as far as backup goes, they wouldn't have spent the draft capital that they would have on Trey Benson in the first place. And so, if there's anybody that's worried about Benson because of the depth chart news in training camp, go trade for him, absolutely, because he's not going to be any cheaper than he is right now.
Yeah.
The player on the Cardinals, or one player on the Cardinals that I think people are pretty excited about is a fully healthy Kyler Murray, who came back in the middle of last season and kind of showed that he he can still be a factor in fantasy. And in the 3 seasons where has stayed healthy, he's been a top 12 QB.
Yep.
And some of those much higher than that. He's arguably got the best group of pass catchers he's had
Right.
Since he came to Arizona. Remember, he was a number 1 pick, right? So the year they took him, they had the worst record in the NFL. And they got better with him. He can run, we know that, and further along in his rehab now, and presumably no limits on his running this season. Is he a sneaky pick to finish as the QB1 this year? Is that crazy to think about? And like, where do you have him ranked?
No, I don't think that's crazy to think about at all. I have him as QB6. I have him just behind Anthony Richardson, Patrick Mahomes. I think there's definitely a world where he could finish as the QB1. Another year removed from the injury. I think the rushing will come back, and he kind of struggled as a passer somewhat last year in the time that he was healthy, and I think that will improve as well. And like you said, he's got Marvin Harrison Jr. back as well. To me, in my mind, I think across the quarterback position in general, I think he's the best value in drafts right now. I mean, he's the quarterback 10 according to the most recent ADP that I saw, and I've got him up at QB6. I'm taking him ahead of Dak Prescott, ahead of Jordan Love, ahead of Joe Burrow, ahead of CJ Stroud, even, all of which that he's going behind right now. So I think that Kyler is the best value at quarterback in drafts right now.
Yeah, early in the off season, prior to the NFL draft, I was doing some best ball drafts because I'm a kind of a sicko there. But Kyler Murray was like going in the 8th round, man.
Yeah, that's sign me up all day. That's a great deal.
In my Scott Fishbowl draft, he was, I think, the 6th or 7th QB taken. So people were high. People were definitely high on him.
And that makes sense with Scott Fishbowl, with how the scoring really lifted up the Russian quarterbacks in the Scott Fishbowl drafts this year. So that makes a lot of sense too.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's move on here to the Seahawks, and again, you just got to love the teams in this division. But a player that had a lot of hype going into last season, but kind of disappointed, was Jackson Smith-Njigba. But this year, he's everyone's favorite bounce back wide receiver. He's still technically behind DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Looking at their ADPs, who do you find yourself drafting more often than not of the Seahawks players in best ball leagues?
JSN's the guy for me. I'm one of these folks that is banging the drum, calling him a bounce back player. I think he was criminally misused in the Seahawks offense last year, and his role just didn't make sense. Like, if you look at what his strengths are as a receiver, and then what they tried to use him as, to me, it just did not make a lot of sense. And it didn't help that he injured his hand early on in the preseason, or in the offseason heading into his rookie year as well. So not only was he starting behind 2 very talented receivers in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, but then he had an injury to deal with as well. And then just his usage didn't make a lot of sense. So I think with the overhaul and the offensive coaching staff that the Seattle Seahawks saw this offseason, I think that there's a lot to be excited about with JSN. And I think that this is the year that he does officially leapfrog Tyler Lockett in the depth chart. I think that him and DK Metcalf will be the clear top 2 options in the passing offense. So he's a guy that I've been drafting a ton, and I think that he's personally undervalued in drafts right now.
Let's talk about their Seahawks backfield for a second. Ken Walker's got 2 seasons in the league. He's been, I'd say, pretty good when he's been healthy.
Mm-hmm.
He was a top 20 running back both of those years, and he's roughly the 10th running back coming off the board so far at ADP for this season. Are you drafting Walker at his ADP, or do you think maybe Zach Charbonnet, who you can get many rounds later and has some standalone value, is a better bet for this season?
Yeah, it's a good question. So looking at, let's see, the most recent Fantasy Pros ADP I have has him as the running back 16.5 PPR scoring, and I have Kenneth Walker as the running back 13 this year. So I'm pretty comfortable with him with where he's going if that ADP holds. Now if it gets much higher than that, then we'll see. And I mean, we'll see what happens with Geno Smith and his injury as well, but I think he's one of the most fun running backs to watch in the league with the explosion that he has. He's not going to offer a ton in the passing game. I think that he will lose some valuable touches in the passing game and possibly even some short yardage situations to Zach Charbonnet. But I also don't mind. I typically don't like drafting my own handcuffs. So if I have Kenneth Walker, I'm probably not taking Charbonnet. But if I'm in a draft and I don't have Kenneth Walker, I also don't mind grabbing Charbonnet late in drafts either, because the reality is it is a new offensive coaching staff. And even though we think we know how it's going to play out, I mean, every year the NFL reminds us that we really don't know what we think we know, and Charbonnet very well could come out and be the guy. So, I'm not too proud to say that even though I think that it's going to be Kenneth Walker, that might not be the case. And so I don't mind taking shots on Charbonnet later, because he's practically free in drafts right now anyway, and he was a good college prospect overall. The only knock that was really on him was that he wasn't an early declare in the NFL draft. He was a 4-year guy, but outside of that, he had a good overall production profile. So I think that you could do much worse than taking shots on Charbonnet if you don't have Kenneth Walker on your team. Is kind of a bet that the Kenneth Walker drafter ends up being wrong.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation because the coaching staff didn't take either one of them.
Right.
And they're both second-round picks. It's kind of like, Walker a higher second-round pick, but they're presumably not beholden to either one of them. So that
right.
I agree with what you said, and I've kind of thought about that backfield the same way, and I'll be interested to see how that breaks down this season.
Yeah, me too.
It is kind of interesting because they have similar skill sets, yet they also complement each other really well, I feel like.
They do. Yeah, I agree. I think they're really good complements to each other. I was very frustrated whenever the NFL draft happened and Charbonnet landed there, because I was excited to see him land somewhere that needed a running back, and hopefully we could have another workhorse type role for a young running back coming into the league, and then he lands with another just so clearly talented running back in Seattle. But to your point, I think that they complement each other very well, and that can be frustrating for fantasy football purposes, but for the most part, it seems like that's where football teams are leaning anyway. They don't really care about us fantasy guys and how much we want workhorses. They just want to be able to rotate fresh guys. And yeah, I think that I think it could be frustrating for fantasy at times, but it makes the Seattle Seahawks offense that much more dangerous, though.
I'm curious to see how Ryan Grubb's new OC in Seattle. We're excited about the receivers. I don't know what he does with running backs, but I'm excited to see what he will do.
Yeah, I am as well. He's got a couple really talented ones to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked a little bit earlier about tight ends, and before there was Kyle Pitts, we had a Noah Fant, and prior to last year, he had 2 top 20 seasons and also 2 top 12 seasons. If you decide to wait on tight end, is Fant kind of the tight end you want to target with that strategy?
I don't think it's a terrible option, but for me, whenever I'm looking at once you get past your top 10, top 12 tight ends, what I'm really looking for is, does the guy I'm drafting have a shot to finish as one of the top 2 options in your team's passing offense? And for me, without injury happening, I just don't see a world for that for Noah Fant. I think that DK Metcalf, JSN, and Tyler Lockett are all going to be comfortably ahead of him. So on a good day, you're looking at him as possibly being the 4th option in a passing offense, maybe the 3rd option. So if I'm waiting on tight end, personally, a guy that I've been targeting a lot that I like is Greg Dulcich over in Denver. Because I think after Cortland Sutton, who really is going to be the next option in that offense. And Greg Dulcich was extremely productive as a rookie before he got injured. And then, he's dealt with injuries, but all reports are that he's healthy coming into the year. So I like taking a shot on him. Even the rookie Ben Sinnott out of Washington, once you get beyond Terry McLaurin, the options there. Jahan Dotson has been pretty up and down since he got drafted, and so similar to what Trey McBride had to do, he's going to have to get beyond Zach Ertz now that he's out there with Cliff Kingsbury in Washington. But there's some other guys that are at that points in drafts that have a better shot at being a top 2 option in their offense, but a lot of those offenses also don't project to be as explosive as Seattle's either. So I think that's the other direction you can go with it, right? If you can't find a guy that's top 2 in his offense, then try to find a guy that's just in a really good offense that has the upside for scoring and for touchdowns. And I do think that Noah Fant has that. And then if a couple things break his way, or if unfortunately some injuries happen to other players, then maybe he does end up being there, because I mean he at least has the athletic profile to be to be a solid pass catching tight end. But I just don't love the situation as much as some of the other guys that are later. And Jelani Wood, I'm also a Jelani Wood sucker out in Indianapolis. I know I get made fun of on our other show all the time for liking Jelani Woods as much as I do, but the guy just has athleticism out the wazoo. And again, similar to some of these other names I've talked about, whenever you get beyond Michael Pittman, like maybe it's Josh Downs, maybe it's AD Mitchell, maybe it's Jelani Woods, who knows? So that's another guy I like taking shots on as well. So I haven't been taking much Noah Fant, but I get it if you want to.
I'll add one more name, Tyler Conklin. I just kind of like that situation with Aaron Rodgers and with what the Jets have after Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. Breece Hall probably be the second most targeted player there.
Probably,
could be. But Mike Williams, I don't know if he can stay healthy.
Right.
They just don't have that much after Wilson. Conklin isn't as talented as most of the guys you named, but he's been a productive player. So he's in, when I'm throwing darts at tight ends late in drafts, I kind of like his name.
Yeah, that's a good name too.
So as long as we're talking about the Jets, we'll talk about the ex-Jet that is the Seahawks quarterback. And you mentioned earlier kind of where he is health-wise, where he might be health-wise. But, he was a huge surprise in 2022 when he was a top 10 QB. It kind of came out of nowhere. He hadn't really had a chance to start in many years since early in his career with the Jets. Then last year, he kind of came back down to earth. So he's really just had that one really good year and then kind of an okay year last year. He's 33 years old. He does have really good weapons and a new coaching staff that I think people are rightly a little bit excited about, just because, it was a lot of years of Pete Carroll. And, anytime that kind of happens, you get turnover. Maybe it's sort of all the old things you thought about an offense are out the window and they can try different things. So, in Superflex leagues in particular, because I don't think Geno Smith is being drafted in one QB leagues to be anybody's QB1 this time around.
Right.
How are you feeling about him? Are you buying him or selling him?
I'll buy Geno Smith. I would have said that much more. Right. I would have said that much more confidently before the injury news came out. Whenever I was talking about my strategy with Superflex leagues earlier, that I like to try to invest in my QB1 early and then wait on my QB2. And I'll take a QB2 and a QB3 both kind of later in drafts. Geno Smith was one of those guys. He's my quarterback 23 right now. And so he's a back end QB2 for me. He's a guy that, for all the reasons you mentioned, since he has been the starter, he's been one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the league, and he's got great pass catchers to throw to, and he's got an exciting new offensive staff to run that offense. So I think that there are good reasons to be excited about Geno, but not excited enough to take him as like a backing QB1 like we were doing. Like last year, a lot of drafts that I was in, I was taking him as a backing QB1, and I was pairing him with Anthony Richardson. I don't typically take two quarterbacks in a one quarterback league, but with Anthony Richardson having so much risk, I said, hey, I'll take Anthony Richardson where he's going, and then a couple rounds later, I'll take Geno Smith just in case it doesn't work out, because I feel so safe about Geno. And then that Anthony Richardson looked great until he got hurt, but Geno didn't pan out, right? But now his draft cost has gotten much more reasonable this year. So yeah, as a back-end QB2 in Superflex leagues, as my QB2 or my QB3, I love Geno at that point, especially if if good news starts coming out about his health. I feel good about Geno.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. The main league I play in, like my main home league, is a 14-team league. So you got to go, a little bit deeper on the QBs that are your QB1s. And I took Tua last year as my QB1 in that league, but I was worried about the concussions. Sure. And so I took Geno. I paired him with Geno so that I had kind of, what I thought was a solid second option that was, for last year was ranked, maybe only a spot or two behind Tua as it was.
Right.
And I ended up, there were a couple weeks I started Geno, and 1 week where I started Drew Lock, because I think the Dolphins might have been playing like the Ravens or something. Like they had a really bad matchup. Right. And it was that game against Philly where Drew Lock threw the winning touchdown to JSN at the end of the game. It was his only TD of the game. But I was a little disappointed in what I got out of Geno last year, but I really took him like you did as kind of like a safety blanket,
Yeah, it turned out not to be so safe.
Not to be that
after all.
safe. Yeah. Yeah. Could have been worse. I could have taken Daniel Jones, who kind of finished, he and Geno 2 years ago, like kind of finished right near each other as like the QB8 and the QB10. So people were high on them and got burned last year a little bit.
It's funny you say that because now they're back to back at QB 23 and QB 24 for me this year. So they're still they can't get away from each other. They're just much different spots in my rankings this year compared to last year.
All right, now of course we saved the best for last. But here we are with the Los Angeles Rams, Drew, and this was by design for sure. Just FYI. But Puka Nacua had the best season ever for rookie wide receivers. But Cooper Kupp wasn't healthy and missed a few games. Kupp is back and healthy this year and is the more proven of the two, and he has a historical season under his belt as well. Could we see both of these guys finish inside the top 15?
I think there's a world where that could happen for sure. Again, if you'd asked me this a couple weeks ago, I'd have been much more confident in my answer than I am now because news came out that Puka apparently banged up his knee, had ice on his knee in camp, and McVay said he wasn't really sure what happened, and so there's really hasn't been any news on what's going on with Puka. But assuming that it's just a minor, just something he needs to walk off or work off. If him and Kupp are both healthy, I could absolutely see a world where that happens. That the Rams beefed up their offensive line a lot this offseason. Unfortunately, their offensive line is somewhat banked up as well, but it seems like that there's a world where all those guys could be healthy by the time the year starts. And Stafford should have the best offensive line he's had since he came over with the Rams this year. And so he's going to have all the time in the world to throw. And now you're talking about two receivers in Puka and Cooper Kupp that get separation as good as anybody in the league. And they're going to consistently get open. And they got Sean McVay calling plays, one of the best play callers in the league. And ever since the Rams got Stafford, McVay gets a little pass happy at times. Even whenever he probably should be running the ball, he just seems like he can't resist just putting the ball in Stafford's hands. And frankly, I can't blame him either. But with that passing volume comes the possibility where both of these guys could see a good amount of targets, because I think that is one good thing about the Rams passing offense is the targets are very consolidated. Like you know who they're going to go to. DeMarcus Robinson's going to get a red zone target here and there. And they're going to dump it off to the running backs, whether it's Kyron Williams or Blake Corum here and there. But for the most part, the majority of the volume is going to go Puka and Cooper Kupp's way. And so I do think that there's a world where if everybody's healthy, that could happen for sure.
Drew, one thing about Puka before we move on to talk about Stafford and then the rest of the offense. He's pretty fearless over the middle, and he took a lot of big hits last year, and he just kept getting up. He would take those hits and get up, but I can't think of a receiver that I saw get hit more and harder last year than Puka. Any concerns with kind of his style of play in today's NFL, or is he just one of those guys that can dish it out, can take it, and probably be fine?
Yeah, I think there's always room to be concerned, and certainly as a Rams fan, there were plenty of hits where I was kind of holding my breath, waiting to see if he was going to get up or not. More hits than I would have liked, but the reality is these guys play a dangerous game, man. And so for me, I go into the season not trying to project or predict injuries because they're so unpredictable, but they're going to happen. But you start to play a dangerous game if you try to predict who's going to get hurt or how many games so-and-so is going to miss, things like that. So I project guys as if they're going to play 17 games and hope for the best as far as that goes. But to your point, he does have a dangerous style of play that has led him to take some big hits. But I think that I think some of that there will be a learning curve for some of that too. Where now year two in his career, he'll start to get better about that. And Stafford does try to protect his guys and where the windows he throws the ball and things like that if he can help it too. So hopefully we'll see less such brutal hits this year too. That's, at least as a Rams fan, that's certainly my hope.
Yeah, I should have prefaced. I was asking you that really as a Rams fan, not so much from a fantasy standpoint. Like, does that make you worry about Puka? Just more. Yeah, no, there were. Fan, you want that guy playing 17 games because he's
absolutely
good. So
yeah, there were far too many times last year that I was holding my breath after he got hit. Hopefully, it won't be the same this year.
I hear you. All right, so we've talked a little bit about Matt Stafford, but he's under contract until 2026. But there's no more guaranteed money after this season.
Yeah.
He's 36 and still productive though when healthy. In one of the better, clearly one of the better offenses in the NFL, and with a great offensive coach.
Right.
He's been banged up a little bit since the Super Bowl season. He's had a couple of different injuries. Is he someone you're buying or selling for this coming season? And just full disclosure, I took him in Scott Fishbowl as my second QB, and was very happy to get him where I did. So I'm hoping you'll give me some confidence here with your answer, but answer as you see fit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm looking for is for him to be my QB2 in Superflex leagues this year. He's a guy where obviously he's not going to be running the ball hardly at all, right? So he's not going to give you much from that standpoint. And so for him to really give you upside as far as fantasy goes, the passing yards and the passing touchdowns specifically have to be inflated. And his first year as the Rams quarterback, I believe he was a top 6 or top 7 quarterback, because the touchdowns were there. And last year, a lot of the touchdowns went to Kyren Williams whenever he was healthy in the running game. And trying to project touchdowns, I talked about the dangers of trying to project injuries. Try to project touchdowns from year to year, and let me know how that works out for you, because that's another nightmare of trying to project, And so it's not crazy to think that some of those red zone touchdowns that went to the running backs last year end up coming through Stafford's arm this year, especially if Cooper Kupp's healthy. I think that's the big thing, because especially in the red zone, Stafford loves to look Kupp's way. I mean, we even saw that toward the end of the year whenever Kupp got healthy, and in the playoff game against Detroit, whenever they got down toward the red zone, he was looking Kupp's way over and over. So if Kupp's healthy, I think that there is more of a reality that Stafford's touchdown numbers go up. And so I don't hate it. I think that whenever you're looking for guys that can score, or that can be backing QB1s or high-end QB2s that don't run the ball, you want to find a guy that's in a good offense with a good play caller and good pass catchers, and check. Stafford's got all of those. So I don't mind that as a QB2 at all. That's exactly what I'm looking for.
Excellent. Well, I took Kupp the round before in Scott.
Oh, you got the stack too? Yeah, that's beautiful.
I stacked him kind of late round 6. I took Kupp. Early round 7, I took Stafford. So
I love that.
Hope it works out. You got to take a few swings in something like Scott Fishbowl. So
absolutely,
taking that stack kind of in the middle of my draft felt pretty good.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Long way to go.
Even though obviously most best ball leagues are 1 QB, it seemed like people didn't really care to stack Puka or Kupp with Matthew Stafford, and you got a big discount when you were able to grab that.
That's true. Yeah, he's an easy guy to stack right now because of that. No, it's a good point.
So another player we talked about earlier was Kyren Williams, who took over the fantasy world in 2023. But like a lot of players, he's dealt with injuries, and he's a bit of a smaller back, and the fantasy community is somewhat turned on him this offseason. To make matters worse, the Rams went out and drafted a similar player in Blake Corum. Looking at how good the Rams offense is Blake Corum a must handcuff if you roster Kyren Williams?
Yeah, I said earlier that I don't typically like to handcuff my running backs, but if I draft Kyren Williams, Blake Corum is a guy that I'm absolutely prioritizing toward the later rounds in drafts. Kyren is a guy that, especially as a guy that is in the fantasy world and is also a Rams fan, Kyren Williams is a guy that can make me look really foolish this year if I end up being wrong, because I'm below ADP on Kyren Williams. I am one of the people that are nervous of the addition of Blake Corum. We've already seen the success with Kyren Williams, especially, at the start of last year, whenever he was putting up big fantasy numbers, he was doing it in a very inefficient way. It was just pretty much volume based. And even though he saw the volume still, once he got healthy in the second half of the year, he was also much more of an efficient player. You saw improvements in Kyren Williams as just the running back. And, but whenever you look at him as far as draft prospects goes, Blake Corum really does just look like Kyren Williams, but just as a better prospect. And so the concern for me would be if Kyren Williams does get hurt again and Blake Corum sees the opportunity, he might not ever let it go. Whereas whenever Kyren Williams got hurt last year, it was really just a bunch of misfits that they were trying to throw together until Kyren Williams could get healthy again. Where now there's finally some real competition in the backfield to where if Kyren Williams gives even a little bit of room for Corum to show what he can do, the offense that, you know, the coaching staff might not want to let up on him. But I think there's a world where Kyren Williams can still be productive, even though Blake Corum is effective, because I mean, Kyren Williams, whenever he was healthy, he was looking at like 75, 80, even 90% snap shares at some point, you know, so even if that comes down to like 65, 35 or, 60, 40, something like that, Kyren Williams could still be a good fantasy asset, but he's a guy I haven't drafted a single bit at this point because of where he's going. I am nervous, and I could look very foolish this time next year if he ends up being the bell cow again, because that is one thing about McVay. Whenever he finds a guy he likes, he loves to give him all the work. The guy pulled C.J. Anderson off the street and turned him into a bell cow whenever the Rams went and lost in the Super Bowl to the Patriots. You know, so I mean, if Kyren ends up being the guy again, I'm gonna look really silly not drafting any of them. But I'm a little nervous about Blake Corum. So if you are drafting Kyren, I would recommend prioritizing Blake Corum toward the end of your draft.
First the Cardinals and then the Rams beating the Cowboys in the playoffs with C.J. Anderson, man. Come on.
C.J. Anderson, man. I mean, what in the world? That still blows my mind to this day.
Yeah, me too, man. I don't understand it.
Street free agents, man.
Yeah, I'm telling you.
Sometimes it just happens, and you got to just say, all right, how many guys are sitting on a couch somewhere who could have one or two really good fantasy games? It's probably a longer list than you'd think.
Same thing happened with Darrell Henderson too.
I picked him up that week.
Yeah,
and got a cheap touchdown. You know, he scored that first. He had scored a couple touchdowns.
Yeah.
All right, we've kind of gone through the four teams, and I think had a really good discussion about each one of them. Now we're just going to hit a couple of kind of general questions about the players in this division, and we'll each answer each one of these. So, Drew, which player from this division do you want on as many of your fantasy teams as possible, regardless of format?
I think whenever you consider his draft cost, it's Kyler Murray. I already talked about, I think he's my favorite value at quarterbacks in drafts right now. So he's a guy that I'm targeting in every single draft I'm in. I think that he is just far too cheap with the rushing upside that he has, and having Trey McBride, adding Marvin Harrison Jr., I think that he should be going much higher than he is. So I'm targeting Kyler in pretty much every draft right now.
Okay, Paul, you want to go second, or you want me to go?
I'll go ahead and go. Okay. You know, even though he has a top 10 ADP, Puka Nacua is the player I want on all of my fantasy teams. He's a cornerstone type of player for me. Although he's now injured, I found this out after filling out the show sheet. But yeah, Puka Nacua is somebody I've been trying to take everywhere and anywhere.
I'll go with two names. One is Cooper Kupp, who I just think is undervalued. I mean, it's only 3 seasons ago that he, had probably the best fantasy football season we've ever seen from a wide receiver. He's been banged up the last 2 years, but I think he's on the wrong side of 30. But whenever he's healthy, he's productive, and Stafford clearly looks his way a lot, and he's relatively cheap right now. His ADP will probably keep going up, but I like where he is now. And another one for me is Deebo Samuel, and it has nothing to do with Brandon Aiyuk. I just feel like Deebo had that one crazy season where he finished as like he had all those rushing touchdowns, and he finished as like the wide receiver 2 or 3 or whatever it was, and his price got inflated, and now it's kind of, more normalized. I think I don't have the ADP in front of me, but he's maybe like the wide receiver, 15 or something like that. And I just think that that's a really good price for him. Between a few, some rushing work that he'll get often near the goal line, and he's just so good with the ball in his hands and so hard for defenses to handle. And I know they have a lot of weapons in San Francisco, but if I can get him as like my wide receiver 2, I feel really good about that. So those are two guys that 2 receivers from this division that I really like getting where I can.
Drew, who's your favorite sleeper in this division?
I think it's a guy I would paint a similar picture to as I did for Blake Corum, and it's probably Trey Benson. Just the explosiveness that he offers at the running back position. James Conner is obviously the clear number one option in that backfield, but similar to talking about if Kyron was to get hurt, would they be able to go away from Blake Corum? I think if James Conner did get banged up, and again, I'm not a guy that's going to project injuries, but he certainly has a history of that happening. I think with the explosiveness that Trey Benson has the offer, and the fact that they just spent the draft capital that they did to bring him to the Cardinals, I think that he is the future of that backfield. And once he's able to show that explosiveness during the season, I think that they would really have a hard time trying to put that back in the garage and say, all right, we're going to go back to James Conner instead, especially considering James Conner doesn't have much of a future in terms of his contract status with the team. I think the young core of that offense is Kyler and Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, and Trey Benson. And so I think that, he's a guy, again, if I have James Conner, I don't think you necessarily have to prioritize Trey Benson. But if I don't have James Conner, I love taking shots on Trey Benson later in drafts and just making the bet that Trey Benson ends up taking over sooner rather than later. So he's a guy that I like taking shots on later on.
Absolutely, man. Dave, how about you?
Yeah, I feel like this division just doesn't have a lot of sleepers because there's sort of a lot of big name guys. Like you look at the 49ers, I mean, like Ricky Pearsall or Juwan Jennings, I can't, barring an injury, I just don't see, any of them getting enough volume. So I'll go back to a guy we talked about earlier in the show, and that's Zach Charbonnet. And again, I just think he's very cheap in drafts, and on the off chance that the coaching staff, for whatever reason, kind of favors him, or maybe Ken Walker gets off to a slow start, or they get tired of Ken Walker not taking the 3 yards that's there and getting tackled behind the line of scrimmage, which happens with him more than it should. Like he's kind of one of those, running backs that gets stopped behind the line a lot and then breaks a 25-yard run. And sometimes coaching staffs don't like that. So, so we'll see. But I think, Charbonnet is a guy, I mean, he was a second-round pick. Like we said earlier, the coaching staff that's there now didn't take either guy. So I kind of like Charbonnet as someone who could return a lot more than what you're paying for him in drafts. So that's my answer. How about you, Paul? Who's your favorite sleeper in this division?
So like you mentioned, Dave, there's not a whole lot of sleepers in this division, but I don't know if Geno Smith necessarily fits the sleeper category, but he's definitely being overlooked and devalued. With a better coaching staff and healthy O-line, I'm betting on Geno to outperform his QB 24 ADP as it currently stands.
Yeah, I think he is a sleeper because he's outside the top 20 QBs. Even in a super flex, he's being drafted as like really a kind of low QB2. So I think that's a fair answer. We'll accept your answer, Paul.
I like it.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that.
All right, now to everyone's favorite thing, we'll talk about busts, which is we can each define what we think a bust is. But in any case, Drew, who is your who do you think might be a bust in this division?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and apologize ahead of time, David. I don't think you're going to like my answer particularly because you just talked about him, and it's Deebo Samuel. And the thing that scares me with him is looking at his current ADP and half PPR scoring. He's going as the wide receiver 13, actually 2 spots ahead of Brandon Aiyuk. And I just think I think that if there's going to be a bust, I think it's going to be somebody from this 49ers offense because they do have so many talented players and they're all being drafted highly. And I get why they are because the offense is so good. But CMC's RB1, Deebo Samuel is wide receiver 13, Aiyuk is wide receiver 15, Kittle's a top 8 tight end. Like somebody has got to miss. Like not all these guys are going to deliver on their ADP. And if CMC wasn't there and Deebo still had the opportunity to have the rushing attempts and the rushing touchdowns, I might feel a little bit differently. But with him being more of, and he still will get some of those, with him being more of a receiver, as explosive, as electric as he is, and man, maybe it's just bitterness because he always seems to just tear the Rams apart. I mean, he absolutely demolishes the Rams every time that they have to play him. But I think he's the guy that I struggle to hit the draft button on the most right now at the current cost. So for me, he would be the bust. I've got him down at like wide receiver 24, I think, compared to the wide receiver 13 ADP. So I am a little bit lower than consensus.
No, that's fair. One thing when I was watching receiver, they put up a stat that's something like in the games Debo has missed, the 49ers have a losing record.
Yeah, their offense is so much better with him.
Yeah, and that isn't just because of his productivity. It's kind of because defenses have to worry about him. But
right.
I don't know. I've never had him like on an league that I care about. So and I've always sort of not had him and watched him beat me.
Right.
It's sort of like your Rams thing. So I kind of feel like a big season is in store for him. But I understand all of your points there. Mine is a player, and you kind of already talked enough about him and the reasons you're not drafting him, and that's Kieran Williams. And I don't think he's going to be a bust. I do think it's a relative term. He's going in the second round, or maybe the third round, but mostly in the second round of drafts. And so he's like after the kind of there's a clear teardrop, I think, after McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, right? And then you have kind of that next group of running backs, and Kieran is in that group.
Yeah.
And I don't really love any of the running backs in that next group at their price because they kind of all have question marks of some kind.
Yeah.
Like Barkley and Derrick Henry changed teams. You don't really know what that's going to look like. But in the case of Kieran, it's everything you said. Could the coaching staff just give enough of the workload to Blake Corum where you spend a second round pick on a guy and he's good, but he's not anything close to what he was a year ago. And I have the same concerns you have. So I do not think he's going to be a bust this year, but relative to ADP, he might be pretty disappointing. Or like you, I'll be eating crow when I don't have any of him, and he gets 90% of the touches. And he's also like, as a smaller guy, I also just worry about him holding up if they do give him that workload again. You can't project injuries, like you said, but he did get hurt last year and missed some time in the middle of the season. So that's my answer. Paul, who's your potential bust candidate in this division?
As the saying goes, love the player, hate the ADP. As the tight end too, Trey McBride is being drafted at his ceiling, and I tend to stay away from those types of ADPs. So Trey McBride is my bust player for this division.
Fair enough.
All right, who's your favorite rookie to draft in this division, Drew?
Man, I'm glad I get to go first because I'm going to take the boring answer here, but I think it's Marvin Harrison Jr. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting for this guy to hit the NFL, and now not only does he hit the NFL, but he gets the top 5 NFL draft capital. And typically whenever guys get drafted that early, you're like, man, this guy just got drafted to a terrible team, a terrible offense. The quarterback probably stinks, and none of that is the case for this guy. He gets to walk in immediately to an offense with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, and he gets to be immediately a top 2 option in the offense right off the rip. And I think that he's going to come in and make an immediate impact. Even though I think he's the most highly drafted rookie skill player in fantasy drafts like ever. But I still don't have any problem with it. I have no issue with where he's going. I think that he could very well deliver on that ADP. And I think he's worth all the hype. I think he's going to live up to it. So I'm taking Marvin Harrison Jr. where he's going, and I think that we are in for one hell of a season with that guy.
I have the same answer, and I can't say it as well as Drew, so I'll just say Marvin Harrison. I will also say I don't think that this division, as much as it's got a lot of really good fantasy assets in the division, I don't think it has, after Marvin Harrison Jr., all that many rookies to be
most of them are rookies.
Excited about it, because it's like there's all these veteran stars at a lot of the skill positions. So, as much fun as it's been to talk about the veterans in this division, I just don't, I couldn't really think of too many other choices that I would even consider. Paul, who's your favorite rookie to draft in this division?
So we've talked about this guy a little bit, and even though he's having a bad training camp, I'll take the discount on Trey Benson. DeMarcado might be the better pass catcher, but even if Benson only gets the rushing work early on, I like his chances to carve out a meaningful role.
Yeah, I like Benson in drafts. Yep.
All right, here we are with Fantasy Edge, Drew, and here you'll share an account, a site, podcast, or other resource you like and use that you feel gives you an edge in fantasy.
It's a good question. The first one that comes to mind for me whenever I'm doing prep work for one of our shows on the Fantasy and Frames Network, or a show like this where I want to try to get ready and be prepared. I think you can do almost any of the homework you want to do on one site, and it's the Fantasy Pros wow, I just went blank right before I said it's not Fantasy Pros. My apologies. The Fantasy Points data suite. That's pretty much what I use for. It's like a one-stop shop for me. If I want to do any type of research, whether it's an entire offense base, an entire defense, a specific player, the Fantasy Points data suite has pretty much anything that you can look for in one stop. And so I used to have to jump from website to website all over the place to try to do my research to get ready for a podcast or a show. And since they launched that the last year or so, that's been my go-to. So I would say if you don't have a Fantasy Points data suite subscription and you're into fantasy football, I would highly suggest getting into that because they've got pretty much everything you need over there.
I like that.
I wrote it down, Drew.
I'm telling you, you will not be disappointed.
Because when I do research for my articles, in season I write a weekly fantasy preview, and I'm looking at I won't name them all, but there's one website that's really good for like looking at every defense in the NFL and what they rank against running backs, wide receiver, and then looking at who are the fantasy football leaders each week, and I'm banging around all these different sites. So I will definitely check that out, because if they have that kind of stuff and it's all under one roof, that would be good for me.
Yeah, they've got all that, and it'll take a while to get used to it because there's so many different ways you can specify what you're looking for. There's different ways you can filter your searches, things like that. Yeah. You can even search it down to like how productive a certain player was against a specific coverage and thing. I mean, it's unworldly what they offer you in terms of how you can look for specific things. So I would recommend that to anybody that's doing any type of research.
Yeah, thanks for the recommendation. Appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And here we are with Fantasy Shoutout, and Drew, part of the reason you're on the show is because Jorge Edwards nominated you here. So share an account you think would be a good guest for this show.
I'm gonna keep the Fantasy and Frames love rolling, man. My boy Rhett Manuel. He's actually the host of our Fourth and Frames podcast that we do every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. And not only does he do that, he also writes a ton of articles for Last Word on Sports, and he's actually an award-winning sports journalist in the state of Louisiana as well. He knows knows what he's doing whenever it comes to sports journalism. He's as good of a fantasy analyst and fantasy a sports journalist as he is. He's an even better person. So I think Rhett would be a great guest for you guys to have.
And what is his ad, so I can write that down and so people can follow him who aren't?
I believe it's at R Manuel Sports, if I'm not mistaken. Let me pull up Twitter real quick to make sure, but I'm almost positive it's at R Manuel Sports. Let me see.
I'll make sure I got his name written down here. I'll make sure to add his at as well for sure.
Yep. It's at RMANUEL Sports. Yep, at R Manuel Sports. You should definitely follow. He also puts out good content on Twitter as well, along with all the other stuff he does. So he's a great follow.
The Fantasy and Frames crew is a big happy family. He's going to be the fourth guy to be on this show.
Yeah, we run deep over there, man. It's a bunch of good people over there, so you can't go. Anybody from the Fantasy and Frames crew, you can't go wrong.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right, here's I think this is Dave's favorite segment in the show. It's Bold Call.
It's yours.
NFC West edition. Drew, give us a bold call for this division.
It's funny you asked me it already, but I'm not gonna sway off of it. A healthy Puka and a healthy Cooper Kupp, equals 2 top 15 wide receivers in points per game over the course of the season. I think those guys are both in for huge years. I think they complement each other really well, and they've got one of the best pure throwers in the game in Stafford, one of the best play callers in McVay. So if everybody involved can have a healthy season, I think that Puka and Kupp both are going to deliver on their ADPs, and actually Kupp I think will far exceed that.
Nice. Dave, what about you?
Well, I should probably change mine now. What I was going to say, because I'm going to talk about the same two guys, my bold call is that Cooper Kupp has more fantasy points this year than Puka Nacua, and
I could see it.
Wide receiver 1 on the Rams, and finishes as a, let's say, top 7 wide receiver overall this year. One kind of last really big year for Kupp. I mean, when he's right and when he's healthy, and it gets to something Drew was saying about how Stafford looks for him in the red zone, he's uncoverable. Like whatever it is about him, the way he moves, and he's bigger than people think, in terms of, as kind of being a big target in the red zone also. So I'm and it's not just because I took him in Scott Fishbowl. I took him for a reason. I took him because I like him to have one last big year. So that's my bold call. Cooper
I like
Kupp,
that.
more fantasy points than Puka, and top 7 overall.
I like that. It's amazing how we've just so quickly forgotten how great he was just a couple years ago. And it's not like his game is a game that's going to age poorly, right? Like it's not like he's a overly athletic receiver that lives off jump balls or anything like that. Like his game overall, assuming he's healthy, should age pretty well. So I like it.
And it's not like that was his only good season. Like he had a couple of really good years, before that also.
He did.
Again, when healthy.
Yep.
Paul, you're the king of the bold calls. What is your bold call for the NFC West?
Every time I do this, I always think about you, Dave. I'm like, okay, what can I do that's not too crazy? Where Dave's like, oh my God, this guy's just being crazy, or man, that's too bold, this and that. So I had a couple of different ones, and then this one finally stuck. So I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this one, Dave. But Kenneth Walker, James Conner, Kyron Williams, and Christian McCaffrey will all have top 12 fantasy seasons in 2024.
So the 4 starting running backs are all going to be top 12. It could happen. The hard thing with that is you're asking them all to stay healthy. But,
exactly, yeah.
It's possible. I mean, someone's got to stay healthy.
If all 4 of them stay healthy, I could absolutely see that happening, though.
Yeah, I mean, they're all in good situations. It's funny, this division, I was just thinking about, there was a time when, and it wasn't that long ago, when this was the worst division in football. And all divisions kind of go through that. But I'm thinking back to, like, you remember the beast mode game where Marshawn Lynch ran through the Saints defense?
Yeah, they barely squeaked into the playoffs.
I'm pretty sure they were 7-9 and won
they were. They were.
And won the division at 7-9. So, and that, that's within the last 15 years, maybe a little more than that. And now, I mean, I wrote a column way back when, around the time of the NFL draft, and I kind of ranked all the divisions in the NFL. And I think I had the 2 North divisions as 1 and 2. And I think I had this division maybe 3rd. I might have had the AFC East ahead of it. But I think this is a really good and interesting division. Again, the Niners are the class of the division. But, when the Rams are right, they've kind of had the Niners number also. And then Seattle, you never know with that team. But they've always been competitive, at least in the last bunch of years, since they won their Super Bowl. And the Cardinals, I mean, if there's a team that's going to like surprise everyone and end up in the playoffs, it's them, I think, from the NFC. Like they were good a couple years ago. I'm a little worried about their defense, which bodes well for their fantasy players, right?
Yeah, it's good. We love it for fantasy.
Yeah, all these guys we've talked about. So it's been a really fun discussion. I like talking about this division because I always feel like this division is so far from where I live. It's like teams that don't get covered a lot.
That's true.
Other than the Niners, who everyone talks about, that you don't hear that much about on the East Coast. So this was a fun discussion, Drew. It was really fun having you on.
I appreciate it, man. I had a blast.
Drew, we can't thank you enough for your time. Before we get you out of here, Let the people know about your content and where we can find it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on Twitter at Drew3MR. Anything that I put out gets tweeted out there. But all of my I do redraft rankings for, like pre-draft for your actual fantasy drafts, and then during the season I'll also do weekly redraft rankings that you can find both on the Fantasy and Frames website and on the Fantasy Pros website, among the expert consensus rankings as well. I've got my dynasty rankings, both startup and rookie rankings are on the Fantasy and Frames website. And then every Wednesday night I'm with my boys Rhett Manuel and Nate Markham over on Fourth and Frames doing our redraft show. Right now we're actually in the middle of our division previews as well, but we're live every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern over on the Fantasy and Frames YouTube channel, Twitter channel, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts, things like that as well. So, whenever it all comes down to it, just go follow Fantasy and Frames at Fantasy and Frames, and anything I put out, you'll be able to find it there. But I appreciate you guys having me on. I appreciate you letting me come talk about my favorite team, my favorite division in football. It's always, anytime I can talk about the Rams, I love to do so. But the division in general is a blast, and I had a blast getting to talk about it with you fellas. So I greatly appreciate the invite.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Dave, before we get you out of here, remind people where they can find you and your content.
Yep, you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at PigskinPapers, which is the name of my old website, but all my content now, and I got a bunch of preseason content up, and there'll be more through August, is at Big Blue View, which is the Giants blog on SB Nation. Paul, how about you? Where can people find you on X, and where can they find your content?
Yes, you can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15, and you can find all of my content there on X and on YouTube as well. So, and if you're a Cowboys fan, or maybe you dislike the Cowboys, tune in on Monday nights as we discuss anything and all things Cowboys.
I'll tell you something, Paul. I'm going to dislike the Cowboys if they don't give CeeDee Lamb a big bag of money, because I took him with my first pick in the Scott Fish Bowl. So, if you could get Jerry and his son to loosen the purse strings, I would appreciate it.
Hey, man, I would have done it by now if I had that kind of power, Dave.
Right.
Well, guys, we appreciate you joining us. I'm Paul Ryan, and we will see you guys next week.